you so much, Chris. So hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Terrific. So thank you so much. I actually had jury duty yesterday in the Eastern District Court in Philly. So I very much appreciate people being flexible and moving with the schedule. I am going to start sharing my screen and then, oh, it says one participant can share at a time. There we go. Okay. I'll start sharing and I'll introduce myself as we go. I call this presentation Social Justice on Social Media. And really it's about the kind of larger picture of where activism and student activism is today and some of the kinds of issues that students and activists and people who deal with student activists are facing right now. And I'd really love it to be, especially since there's about 9 of us, I'd love for it to be more of an interactive discussion. So really, I'm just going to kind of talk to you all about what a sociologist's perspective on these questions is, especially a sociologist who studies social movements. And then we can get into some discussion, some questions, see how alums have been thinking about these issues. So just to get started, I am a sociologist. I'm a political, institutional, social movement sociologist. I am the head of the anthropology and sociology department here. I've been here since 2006, and my research is at the intersection of the kinds of questions we'll be talking about today. So looking at social movements, looking at business, looking at democracy, and at how those 3 things come together. I've written a book called Do It Yourself Democracy that's about the public engagement industry. So these are facilitators, people who facilitate public engagement processes. But if you think about other places where social movements, business, and democracy come together, you might think of Colin Kaepernick and Nike or something like that. You know, these kinds of intersections that we see today of a blurring of the kinds of boundaries of what we think of as civil society and private enterprise, et cetera. Okay. So in terms of social justice at Lafayette, just to orient folks who haven't been on campus lately, there is certainly a lot of student activism at Lafayette. We've had students sit in, and this was in 2016, protests during the national anthem at the football game. We've had a lot of student activity in the arts around Black Lives Matter and social justice, and we've had, as institutions have all over the country, had Instagram accounts about Black at LAF, anti-violence at LAF, et cetera. So just give you a sense about that. That's happening at Lafayette, but there's also a lot of conversations on activism happening at Lafayette. So the students are really thoughtful about how, where do you put your energies? You might be frustrated about a lot of what's going on in the world. And where do you put your energies? You've got limited amount of time. For instance, during the pandemic, you all are familiar, but most students were remote in the fall. They were maybe on campus in the fall, but limited in how often they could get together. So there's a lot of restrictions on students' time and sort of where they think they can put their energy. We've had Lafayette Votes, which was an initiative from all different parts of the campus to engage students in the election and to try to get them mobilized around registering to vote and voting for the students who were citizens of the U.S. And we had a lot of educational, panels and things like that, but we also had students talking about what student activism looks like on campus, where they should put their energies, whether it's even worth it to engage in the contemporary political system, what apathy looks like for their generation, et cetera. Just to give you the background of sort of where we are in terms of thinking about this in sociology, a lot of scholars call our contemporary society a social movement society. And, here you can see some examples protests that have happened in the last sort of 10 years, and you see the Rally to Restore Sanity. That was a sort of Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert rally a while back that was sort of in response to the Tea Party. You see a couple of different trends here. The social movement society, you don't basically everybody's protesting everything all the time, right? And those people who are protesting may not be people who you conventionally think of as social justice activists, right? So you might see people on the right protesting. They have always been engaged in social activism as well. But that sort of picture that people have in their head of the civil rights movement, of the 1960s, and what that looks like, what it looks like when you're, holding a sign, et cetera, it has changed quite a bit. And so one of the things that we see down in the bottom right of this corner is you actually see corporations mobilizing constituents, right? So you see an energy citizens that it's not just enough for corporations, for elites to sit in a dark room, to sit in the back smoke-filled room and decide things. That having public support gives people legitimacy, and they're willing to pursue this even when they don't actually have public support. My collaborator Ed Walker studies. My collaborator Ed Walker studies what we typically call like grassroots lobbying, this kind of energy citizens group, and the consultants that facilitate that. And basically, he finds that sort of astroturfing, the fake grassroots stuff, it is quite rare, just because it is very valuable to companies to actually find constituencies to mobilize. So you'll see this sort of smokers' rights groups being mobilized by Philip Morris via a consultant, and they'll give the smokers petitions to sign, or just sort of all of the architecture that subsidizes people's participation in politics. So we have this like very widespread mobilization of engagement. Here is what that picture that we typically have of what traditional social movement activity looks like. It's aimed at decision makers. It's typically aimed at the state, okay, at the government. If you look at the signs from the March for Jobs and Freedom, which was what it was called, I always sort of enforce this with my students, that it was the March for Jobs and Freedom, that there was this real linking of political rights and economic rights. So you see in terms of traditional social movements, people who are not able to get what they want through traditional government channels will mobilize, and take to the streets, et cetera, use contentious strategies to get attention. If you look at these signs, you can see that they're all actually printed professionally, and there's a variety of them, but they're the same, right? Very different from that sort of authenticity that people want now with the handwritten sign, et cetera. That this was very much about respectability politics, and you can see that in the suits that they're wearing, et cetera. Here's two examples of this kind of traditional social movement. You have the 1936 sit-down strike at GM, right, where the workers literally sat down at the assembly line, and you have the World War I Veterans March to demand veterans benefits. This is the origins of the VA. And, in this case, this was actually one of the first Occupy movements. The veterans actually set up tents, right? And I talked to the students about what does it mean for, veterans to come back from war. These men who generally, do not have partners and kids already, right? Like they can afford to sit in a tent, on the steps of the Capitol, and they also know how to use weapons, right? So that can be a really powerful kind of protest. If you think about the role of young people in activism, traditionally, young people have been very involved, right? We see Project C in Birmingham, just filling the jails with children. You see the sit-down strike at, where the students were from North Carolina A&T, right? One of the HBCUs in North Carolina. And they were freshmen. they were first year students, right? And so you see that, that young people are very central to movements for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they have less to lose, right? That during the Montgomery actions, people, adults have to go to jobs, right? They have jobs that they're going to. They've got families that they're committed to, and that young people have sort of less of those commitments and are better able to take the risks that social movement activism involves. In terms of student activism at Lafayette during this time and up to now, you have the strike in 1970, right? So this was now 51 years ago, and Skillman has some great resources on student activism. But you have the students actually sitting out, striking from class. But what they did was they went out into the Easton community and were knocking on doors and talking to Easton residents about the war. If you take that up to today, you see the school strike for climate, by Greta Thunberg. That's been very influential. She was a high schooler, and you've also seen during the pandemic, for instance, RAs striking because they didn't think that their institutions were doing enough to keep students safe from COVID. So the sociologist perspective on what's changed here, right, is that in what we call new social movements, right, which are generally after the 1960s, they tend to be driven more by beliefs and values instead of economics, right? Instead of economic and political rights. They tend to emphasize cultural change and personal growth. They have supporters rather than members. So they have people who sort of mail a check rather than people who belong in these sort of chapter-based, very hierarchical organizations. There's a national organization that you send a check to. And they have much more informal, loose organization. So they tend to be, if you think about Occupy and what the sort of organizational structure looked like of Occupy, there wasn't even really a sort of coherent national organization. There are just activists who are able to coordinate large groups of people through Twitter, et cetera. And that can be very powerful now. So those social media tools have enabled, activists who don't have a lot of access to resources to mobilize publics. Okay, the final piece of this, which is really where my research lies, is this increased targeting of non-state actors. So like corporations and universities, right? So we start to see these targets being much more of the focus. You see Mizzou. And right after that, in 2015, we had a big discussion on campus called More Than Mizzou. And you have activists targeting corporations like Nike. The reason why they're targeting corporations is because they're so powerful today, right? Corporations are also much easier to get the attention of, right? And so they tend to be responsive. They tend to be, willing to sort of countenance activists. They often, and this is part of my research, they often incorporate a lot of social movement tactics into the way that they manage their cultures, et cetera, to sort of tap into that authenticity. Excuse me. I was sitting in that AC all day yesterday. As far as movements on campuses, we have movements that are directly targeted to campus administration. So you have Fabio Rojas at IU has written this book about how activists moved Black power from the streets into, the academy, right? Made Black studies an academic discipline. You see Occupy at Berkeley, et cetera. You see students protesting and having tear gas fired at them from campus police. And at Lafayette, you have students organizing to form ABC. In 1968, you have this same sort of activism that they presented a list of demands, and those demands resulted in increased hiring of Black faculty, et cetera. So this is my last slide, actually. And I'm really interested in sort of where you all want to take the discussion, but we can go anywhere with this. The first point here, as far as social media activism at Lafayette, social justice activism at Lafayette today, is that there's a lot of contemporary research that says that the liberal arts, PWI, that's a predominantly white institution, and elite context matter for students' choice of contention versus other strategies. So one of the choices facing Lafayette student activists is, do they target the administration, or do they target, some larger entity, right? Are they trying to get national or regional or local attention, or are they trying to target Allison Byerly, right? And one of the research on student activism says that in general at liberal arts colleges, the students focus a lot on the administration. And it's because they have close relationships with people in intercultural development, with the sort of adult administrators. They tend to have closer relationships with them, so they see them as sort of accessible. And they don't want to be too contentious. So that definitely affects, there's a study comparing Latinx activism on campus at a liberal arts college in Southern California to a state college and a UC. And you see that the UC students are, are much more sort of preoccupied with the politics of the campus groups. And the students at the state college are actually the ones that are oriented towards those outside actors, right? Towards getting involved locally in their local political system. So as far as the choices to target the admin, do you target the other students for attitude changes, right? Do you target the Easton community? You saw in that protest from the 1970s school strike, right? That the Lafayette students were going out into Easton. I can't really envision Lafayette students going out into the Easton community and having that same sort of conversations with Easton residents today, because I don't think that they see the community as being sort of the center of their activism or important to them in that way. Are they looking for cultural and personal change, or are they looking for policy change and economic change? And here really the sort of social media activism is very much focused on cultural and personal change, and then to a lesser extent demands that a focus on policy change from university and college administrations. What's the role of social media? How do they combine social media with more traditional strategies? So when I gave you guys that that sort of ideal type of a traditional social movement and a new social movement, most movements combine some elements of both, right? So you'll see something that looks a lot like a traditional movement, but that's mobilizing with social media strategies. You'll see something that looks like a traditional social movement, but it might not be particularly organized, right? They may not be. They may just have sort of a loose group of supporters. So how do those different strategies complement or conflict with each other? And then the issue that I think is really interesting, and this came up with the talk I was highlighting by one of our alums who now works at Deloitte on DEI issues with them. But he did a lot of research when he was here in the college archives on student activism. And when there were protests at Lafayette, he was collecting the signs and things that students were holding, right, for Lafayette to keep as historical records. One of the main issues for students activists is that student activists are, very passionate. They're very informed because they're taking all these classes, right? They're active. They have the sort of freedoms that I've been talking about to use their free time for activism. But the biggest problem for students is that they turn over so quickly, right? That as soon as you build a movement, you're graduating and out the door. And so any sort of momentum that you build is always kind of in danger of being lost. So what kinds of records you keep actually matters, and what kind of administrative turnover matters, right? That if you're targeting Allison Byerly and you've been working at targeting Allison Byerly for a long time, then the fact that she's going to move on to Carleton and we're going to have Nicole Hurd means you may need to have different strategies to work with Nikki Hurd than you would with Allison. So I'm going to hold on. Let me exit and stop sharing so I can see all of you. Hey, everybody. I can see a lot of friendly faces. Feel free to turn on your camera. Hey, Becca. Hey, Jeff. And I know a lot of you are experts on this kind of thing. Mark is a lawyer who does we've been talking by email, who does work with activists around free speech issues, and certainly all of the new issues that have come up around the January 6th protests. And limiting free speech even more. So I know lots of you will have interesting things to say. We're parts of these student movements, and I'm just looking forward to hearing from you. And since we've got about 12, feel free to get in the chat if you don't feel like talking, or to just raise your hand, and we'll go from there. Thoughts? Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, in the 60s, Vietnam started, and most of us went through the 2-year military program. And if you stopped at the 2-year military program, you pretty much could continue in college. If you went through the 4-year program, which would lead to reserve officer, you pretty much were going to be sent to Vietnam. So we got wind of, we put our heads, don't forget, at Lafayette then, we had representatives of the Army, the Air Force, and the Marines, and a couple of Navy, not too many. But we put our heads together and we figured out what was going on in Vietnam very, very early. As a matter of fact, the general of the Army, who happened to be General Decker, was a graduate of Lafayette, and he had tried to stop the special forces at the very, very beginning, but unfortunately was replaced with someone else, and Vietnam started to escalate. So the protest pretty much began there around around 63, 64. The protest movement started to grow. And of course, in this case, it wasn't just against for or against minority studies, it was for against being killed or killing someone else.
Right.
So the center of the protests and the center of the protest movement was in Hog Hall. There was a coffee house that we had called the Gourd. And we had, this is the folk era, so we had folk singers come and poets and students who were poets. And the center of the activity there was, the center of the anti-war movement was, and civil rights too. We even had the leader of the NAACP, I think it was Mr. Smith, who was a cook from Houston, would come and visit us. So we had a very, very active movement, which was pretty much nonviolent, as most of the anti-war civil rights movements were. But at least there was a center. Now I'm curious, I've been up at the college to visit, and I noticed there's like a coffee house down just off the steps at the foot of the hill. There's a little bookstore, coffee house. I don't know the name of it. It's right down the block from the Lafayette Steps.
Three Birds, maybe?
I don't know the name of it, but it's
Right.
like a combination bookstore,
right,
old books, and the coffee house.
Oh, the Quadrant, yeah.
Oh, is that the Quadrant?
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, is there any kind of center? I'm sorry for the long introduction. Is there any kind of center now for students who are being involved in political action?
I think that's a really good question, and I would just say, from the social movement standpoint, those places, the physically rooted places where people meet to get together, and where they're, organizing, and where you're actually able to sort of create that community, are really, really important. And, that's something that you're missing with social media, right? And so, I would say that particularly during the pandemic, the students have not had that. Right. They might actually have it at, for example, Portlock or something like that, or at Farranon, or at Landis, or somewhere, that there are these sort of sites on campus where students who are active might meet, but that you really lose that kind of, just sort of cultural effervescence that you get in a particular location where you've got activists and you've got people with markers making signs and things like that. I would say, for sociologists, there's 3 different elements of the movement. There's political opportunities, there's resource mobilization, and there's the sort of cognitive liberation piece of that, right? And that while you're mobilizing resources, and those might be economic, or they could be the example that we give in the civil rights movement is spirituals and music, right? That's an essential resource that people were using. Those all play into that cognitive liberation piece. That's really important. And I think you do lose something really dramatic when you have people organizing during a pandemic, that might be taking the play, that meeting online and Zooms and stuff might be taking some of that, but it certainly doesn't give that meeting people fully as people in a particular place. So that's a great question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let's see, Martha has some questions. She says, how do you classify the protests in Portland? How do you view changes post-pandemic when people are back at work and activities and less on social media? And what are topics that I see on the horizon? Those are all great questions. Can I throw this back at you, Martha, on how you view the changes post-pandemic when people are back at work and activities and are on social media less? Do you have any sense? If you can't unmute because of where you are or something, I totally understand. I'm going to pick on it. Alex, do you have any ideas how people are going to respond post-pandemic?
Post-pandemic?
Yeah.
I feel like there might be a change. I mean, I'm just speaking. I think that kept some people from people participated socially or virtually because of the pandemic. And I don't know, in Detroit is where I live, and we've been having since last summer, we still have had continuous protest movement. I don't know, different things. But I think it shrunk because of the pandemic, or the size of people going out in person. So I would think it would increase. Like, I know we had a recent protest for Palestine, and yeah, I'm not sure. I think it'll change. That's my guess. I think more, but also social media is such a large part of like mutual aid, and yeah.
I would say that the students are on social media so much. Like, I mean, the students, me, I am on Twitter so much that, I don't think that the pandemic necessarily changes that. I would actually say, and I think Mark could speak to this too, that during the pandemic, there was a ton of social movement activity out in the streets, right? That we see the George Floyd protests, this past summer. You actually see a lot of, activism despite the pandemic, which is telling you how much of those collective action problems people are having to overcome to actually get out in the streets and do that. And you saw a lot of social movement activity in concert with that, right? So that while that movement is happening in the streets, you're seeing a lot of that in the summer, and you were seeing a lot on these Black at Loth accounts, et cetera. And then I have to say that those accounts have petered out a little bit, that they're much less active than they were right at the start. Yeah, and Martha, I see people could go out then, not so much once dispersed at work. Yeah, I think work plays into this too, right? That actually the pandemic enabled people to protest, because you've got a lot of unemployed people, you've got a lot of people who are home, and that work is really limited, right? So I think for students, being back after the pandemic is probably galvanizing, and I think for those of us who are going back to work and finally just recouping after a lot of time spent with our kids, we might be even less able, right? Mark, did you have any comments on that?
Hey everybody, thank you, Dr. Lee, for inviting me to give a thought on this. So I'm Mark Goldson. I'm a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and I represent, as Dr. Lee said, I represent the activists in D.C. who come in to try to change public policy, and including such notables as Jane Fonda and Dr. Reverend Barber, and people like that are coming into D.C. to try to impact federal policy. And I think I was actually preparing speeches before the Maryland bar and the D.C. bar, in which I was going to talk about protesting during the pandemic. And when I first thought about it, I said, nothing has happened during the pandemic. All we had was, social interactions on social media. And then we had, some stupid car rallies and so forth. But when I look back at the year, it really was the most dramatic year in terms of public protest since the 1960s. And that's because, as Dr. Lee mentioned, the George Floyd protest really galvanized things all across the country. Big cities, little cities, towns, municipalities, all were discussing, police immunity, police power, chokeholds, interactions between the community, whether or not the police should be defunded, efforts towards increasing mental health services in the community instead of sending out the police. So the George Floyd protest was really, really, really dramatic, and I don't think that we should underplay how important those national protests were. They weren't national; they were in the grassroots. They were at the community level, and then that was largely a left-led movement. Black Lives Matter. On the right, however, as typified by the Capitol insurrection January 6th and the storming of the Michigan State Capitol, the right, on the other hand, was engaged in things that may not qualify as traditional public protest and may have actually crossed the line into domestic terrorism by bringing guns into the Michigan State Capitol and basically threatening the Michigan State legislators to vote the way that they wanted, or else something was going to happen with respect to their guns. We saw the same thing on January 6th. So what we're seeing in Washington, D.C., the home of protest, at the Supreme Court, at the White House, and at the Capitol, where everything's fenced off and gated off, and there's still a lot of National guard around. The question is whether or not that nonviolent civil disobedience, where people organize and are going to block a street, block a highway, block a road, block a doorway, in a nonviolent manner to affect social change, whether that model is now thrown out the window and the new model is going to be, if we don't get what we want, we're going to storm the Capitol with guns and bear spray and so forth. So I think there's a real concern, at least in Washington, as to whether or not there really is that sort of traditional model of nonviolent civil disobedience that's going to be impactful, because people, I think, it's either we're going to be shut down because we can't get access to the legislators or the people in power in Washington, or we're going to have to storm the Capitol. So free speech in DC is very, very unsettled right now. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to get my thoughts in for this presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And this issue of sort of once violent tactics get used, you get reclassified, right? In the public's eyes, or in terms of the law. This sort of history of violence in politics is being revisited, and people are looking back at. I gave my husband a book for Christmas about the use that says this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. Right, that's about the use of guns and just sort of training each other in using guns in the Black Civil Rights Movement. As part of this sort of choice that activists are always making between non-violence and then this kind of normalization of protest where you sort of seem like you're failing to get heard. If you compare the January 6th to the Wisconsin State House protests, which from a social movement standpoint were actually pretty successful, but just did not make nearly as much of a stir as just a drum circle sitting in the center of the Wisconsin State House. Jeff, you've had your hand up.
Yes, first I want to say thanks to Mark for kind of contrasting the two different protest movements that we saw. I'm also based in DC, and it's been a tumultuous year, and just thanks for elevating that. My question for Professor Lee is, I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on the way that student protests are presented in, say, like op-eds in the Wall Street Journal. I'm particularly surprised that they try to portray them as like these kids are the most radical thing that we've ever seen, but comparing that to like the students in the 70s during Vietnam protests that would seize like the president's office. Like, do you think that there are things that they're missing about student engagement, and do you think they're skewing it intentionally to get a particular point across?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jeff. I think this question about the way student protesters are portrayed, right? It is fascinating, and it's one that depends on which media sources you're looking at, right? So, sort of who's being portrayed and what are they trying. I think there's a lot of portraying, students on the left as, woke snowflakes, right? Being empowered by their, lefty Marxist professors or something like that, right? That you see a lot of this kind of assumption, in the sort of, and I guess that's anything from the New York Times like op-ed page to, that students are, that a lot of student activism is around, this sort of caricature is that a lot of it is around language, and that a lot of it is around dumb stuff like, the banh mi at the, Occidental cafeteria not being authentic or something like that, right? That the student protests are trivial, that they're mostly about, policing other students' wokeness, et cetera, and that the stakes are, lower than, that the stakes are lower than what Rob is talking about, where students were going to go get killed, right? That if you can imagine striking when that's the situation, and that these students are sort of comfortable. I think on the other hand, what you're talking about is this idea that students of this generation are more insecure than ever, right? Are facing climate crisis, fiscal crisis, governmental crises, that are just, radically unlike what we've seen, right? And that students might be, that this sort of type of activism that we're seeing is a little discomforting for people, right? That students are seeing. Is that what you're saying? That students seem a little, that the portrayal is that students seem like more activists than they have been in the past.
Right, they're being portrayed as the crazy left. And that some of my protests in the cafeteria are things that is like the most radical thing that we've ever seen, and trying to sort of, I'm wondering if it's about like trying to, convince the students themselves that they are super radical already. They don't need to rethink what they're fighting about.
Yeah. And so, this is really an interesting point. I do think that there's a kind of grain of truth in the fact that most of the student activism that's taking place at for example, Lafayette is targeted at the administration, right? Is very much targeted at, making demands of the administration around curriculum, making demands around hiring faculty, making demands around public safety. Right, those are reflecting defund the police movements, et cetera, asking to disarm, Lafayette Public and Peace Safe, and that is, on the one hand, it's much more radical. I've been teaching this stuff since 2006, so like I've seen students go, and I used to show students pictures of the student protesters in the UK when the fees got raised. They pay much less to go to school than students in the US. But when their fees got raised from something like $15,000 to $20,000, they were lighting cars on fire and tipping them over, like it looked like sort of the after a bad a Big Ten football game, right, like riots in the street, throwing stuff at Prince Charles's car, etc. And and I've asked students, like, why would that not happen here? Do you think you'd ever see protests against Peace Safe that you see that we've been talking about in Ferguson? And students at the time, like sort of 2 years ago, would say, no one would ever protest Peace Safe. We kind of know those guys, they're okay, and so there definitely has been, I think there definitely has been a shift along with the country. I would also say that in terms of the tenor of activism, like whether it is more radical, certainly the January 6th protests involved a lot of young people, right? A lot of those guys were pretty young. I would also say that that in terms of the Me Too activism, the Title IX activism on campus, and the NCAA, the student activists around NCAA, rules and unionization have actually been very successful. So that I would say they've actually sort of gotten more traction. Like they've basically been more successful than than student activists in the last sort of I would say like 2005 to 2015, there was certainly student activism, but it didn't get the kind of traction that Title IX, and the student activists have had. Mark, you've had your hand up for a long time. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you for doing this talk. I wanted to ask more kind of about the corporate piece that you'd mentioned earlier. So it's one of the things that I've kind of thought of as we've sort of been watching social movements. Like it really seems like we've really shifted from, and not completely, but to a certain extent, we've shifted from focusing on the government to focusing specifically on companies and calling them out for what they're doing and trying to get them to kind of be the change agent. And I'm wondering if you think that's like a function of like a follow the money approach, or if it's something where it's more just around like partisan gridlock in Washington, where people just don't think that targeting the government or targeting their local representation or something like that is as effective, or just kind of what's been sparking that? Because I feel like in the past, kind of what you'd said was it was really more targeted, government action. That was kind of the power center.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I do not have the answer to that. I mean, in terms of, I certainly, I think what you're saying is true, right? That there's partisan gridlock in DC. I mean, that's just absurd, right? There's nothing able to get done there. So, why would you, target DC in the first place? There's a lot of companies that are very interested in authenticity, that are very sensitive to PR. You can target them with Twitter. You can actually be like having a back and forth with somebody from the company on Twitter, right? And so they're more accessible. They're more responsive. They're tremendously powerful, right? And so I think on the one hand, the kind of looking at and there's also companies that are very active and out there, not just responsive to activists, but really out front. The sort of Patagonias, the social responsibility, social enterprise movement is very much a part of this. And so you see these companies really doing soul searching. I mean, like some pretty deep soul searching about, these issues and how they can do better and what's the role of capitalism in all of this. And maybe we can be sort of like semi-capitalist, but also have this social piece. And so, I do think that they're really responsive. That said, the places where these corporations are very, very powerful, right? And we've been targeting corporations. Certainly social movements have been doing this, forever. Actually, the types of nerds that I study, right? We're all really into these sort of like 1900s, 1800s movements against corporations. But so it's been going on for a really long time. But the companies have retained that power. Like there hasn't been a significant change. If we're talking about Facebook's control over, all media and right, that the sort of corporate concentration has only continued, right? And that makes it easy for activists to target, Facebook. But the ways that companies have responded by self-regulating, like Facebook having its own Supreme Court, don't seem to be very satisfying for activists, right? I mean, that you're not changing the fact, you're not changing concentration of wealth, right? There's still, as much as people want to protest Elon Musk or whatever, that he's still, competing to go to the moon with, this was like the most recent thing, right? That he and Jeff Bezos are like competing to go to the moon or something. That concentration of power in the hands of a few and the ways in which that has not been used to the benefit of the public interest is I think only increasing. So activists definitely are increasing the ways that they're targeting corporations. Corporations are responding. I don't think a lot of the sort of essentials of that have changed. So there's really interesting stuff going on, and that might change a little bit in certain pockets. So you see a lot of targeting of the sharing economy companies, of Uber, and you see these kind of odd bedfellows, that like Airbnb is doing all of these grassroots campaigns, saying that they're against big hotel or big taxi, and so in various places like San Francisco, there have been some sort of successful campaigns against companies, but I think the sort of power structure remains, pretty unshakable as it is right now. Is that?
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. I feel like you said it all with the example of Facebook having their own Supreme Court. It's like, where, where is the line gone? But
Right.
anyway, thank you.
Right. Yeah. No, thanks a lot, Mark. And Alex, I'm looking, yeah, why, like, are they responding to cuts of like $1,500, and here are, students graduating into just, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt, and they're not doing nearly as much, and nearly as, sort of violent protests. It's a really interesting question. At the same time, I would say that the canceling student debt movement has gotten way more traction than it ever had before. That having talked about this for sort of 15 years, like, oh my gosh, that's being talked about in serious political circles in ways that, were unthinkable. I would say, sort of 5 to 10 years ago. So, this is always the question with social movements: is how do we define success? Do we define it as redefining conversations, redefining the ways that people think about things, right? There are actually a lot of there's a lot of progressive successes, and there's a lot of right-wing successes, right? If you think about movements as being able to achieve their goals. So we have gay marriage as like a signal issue. You see that changing very, very, very quickly, right? Then you have of course, agreements about disagreements within the queer community about, is gay marriage really even what we want to be fighting for, right? That's not even something that that is meaningful for many queer activists. So you see a lot of successes and qualified successes, and you also see a lot of fights and conflicts within movements about whether those goals have been achieved, whether they're the right goals. And what I would say as a social movement researcher is that's all really typical, right? That it's very sort of endemic to social movement activity to have those kinds of conflicts, and they're normal, and it's not a sign that things are completely dysfunctional, or that people don't know how to do movements anymore, that they're doing social movement activity online and it's not successful, but that these kinds of disagreements that students have about where we should be directing our action, how should we be doing it, who should we be targeting, should we be a little more violent, if getting ourselves out there and doing risky things is going to get attention. Other questions? I see we're bumping up against.
Hi, Professor.
And hi, Becca. How are you?
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much for doing this session. We appreciate
Sure.
it. So I am an alum of Lafayette, class of 2012, but I also work at Lafayette. But because of the pandemic, obviously I've been quite detached from campus. So I'm totally out of touch with what's going on campus. I'm relying on virtual mediums like the social media accounts that you mentioned earlier. And I'm assuming that the social media accounts have broadened the reach of the students' messaging in terms of their protesting. But I'm wondering if those accounts have had any impact on campus, or whether they're correlated to any changes that have been made on campus, or if they're really intended just to expand the reach to alumni, people outside of Lafayette's core network to spread the word.
Right. I wouldn't pretend to speak for those students. Thanks, Rob. But I would say both and, right? That the students are well aware of the limits of social media, right? We all are aware of just of how right, that you're only speaking to the alums. Somebody, the problem with getting and I saw this happen on those accounts. The problem with a forum where anyone can talk and anyone can go on is you can get vote bombed or whatever, and people can try to distract the conversation to their issues, and it can just become a morass, right? The students are aware that, like, being in person, having events on campus, being co-located and being able to talk things out, being able to just do Zooms, etc., is really important for their organizing. I would say that there are political things that happen on campus that I don't see a whisper of on social media, right? That I only hear about from, seeing students in the classroom or just chatting with them before class on Zoom. So I would say there was a big political issue around student government this year that was very sort of piecemeal in the college newspaper. I still don't quite understand exactly what it was all about, but I saw very little of that on social media. And so, if it's on certain people's social media, they may be seeing it and everyone else is sort of in the dark. So I do think it has sort of limited applicability. I don't know that there's a great way for alums, or people who are off campus to kind of keep their finger on the pulse without knowing current students. You know what I mean? I mean that I only, there's a lot of stuff I only know about from talking to students, and the best resource that I have for that is the LAF, right? Is that the Lafayette actually has some great reporting, and they're doing their best to keep on top of it. But when they're remote, it certainly is a challenge. So yeah, I think it's sort of both. And I think there's a lot going on social media, but it is by no means the end of the story. Any other questions?
Is there a tendency, this is Robert Williams Nail speaking, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, good. I never know with my equipment working over here.
Right.
For certain things to be cellular, if you know what I mean. I don't have social media, half my family does, but anyhow.
Right.
But things are insular or cellular that part of the, with related to the last question, things that are going on that you don't hear about.
Right.
But other people within their cell, so to speak, of social media connections,
right,
would. And how do you think that affects in terms of people protesting or here I am, yeah, that works. In terms of people organizing, those kind of things, we start to organize in smaller cells. And how does that connect with a larger movement? I date back from the time when the Gourd was operating, by the way. I used to serve coffee in there. But that was, so something broader. And so there is that pull between the fact and depending on anymore, we always talk about, depending on what your interest is, your perspective is, where you get your news, that's a whole other piece of social media, does affect perhaps movements.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. I would say, for the social movement scholars, thinking about what was so successful about the 1960s, and before then, the women's movement, progressive movements, et cetera. It was that there were small groups of people, right, in their town, in their church, in their women's organization, in their city or whatever, who were, learning how to do this together and getting good at it, and eventually sort of moving up to higher levels or connecting with other groups of women, right? If we use that example, or connecting with other church groups, are you interested in this too? And so I think, that sort of face-to-face contact of sharing, there's my collaborator, Francesca Paletta, has a book called Freedom is an Endless Meeting, right? that the social movement work is really, about meetings, right? It's really about being at coffee shops, and it's really about talking about what matters to you. And, that's partly why campuses are such great places, for situating mobilization, is because they're places where students are really passionate and talking about what matters the most to them, and what they're most frustrated about. What are I think very much that is still absolutely critical. I think that there's some ways that social media and new technologies have connected students outside of those little cells with what's going on nationally. So let's say, if you're on the sports team and you're that's your insular environment, you're connecting with those guys in a way that you might not otherwise, that you might start hearing about what's going on the football team at Colgate,
or what's good. Did you hear that they took a knee at the Colgate game or something? You know, that you might be connected to other teams and other actions in ways that are, you know, are pretty easy, right? You know, that you
Yeah.
just follow that player for, you know, from your high school. That's and you know, I think at the same time, exactly what you're saying, you're connected to these sort of national conversations in a way that's you know, just through media, on social media, right? That you're following that, and you're being sort of connected to those larger forces. But I think there's a lot of I guess I would call it like a centrifugal force, right? That's the one that's pushing you out, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot of sort of splintering of the groups, that the students are in insular sort of cells, but they're in a lot of different ones of those, right? And so they're sort of managing the impressions in lots of different ones. And, you know, you might be a player who has a social media account, but you're expected on that social media account to be repping the Leopards, you know, and your coach follows you, and you're, you know, that it's not really a place where, you know, talking about issues that matter to you feels authentic or you know, unsurveilled, right? And so I think that you know, there are new challenges to that kind. I think it's very much still the way that social movements build, but I do think that there are sort of new challenges in the kinds of distractions that students are dealing with, and in the way that they're supervised and overseen. Anyhow, bye to the people who are signing off. Thank you guys so much for coming. I thought it was just going to be me and Chris. So. And you know, this has been a fantastic meeting just because I found out about the gourd. Now I'm gonna go right over to college archives and look stuff up about it. I can't wait to find out more.
Yeah, the gourd was just a little bit of history on the gourd. The gourd was it was actually a ministry of the Lafayette College Church, which was Presbyterian related, by the way. And the church ceased to exist some years ago. But what it was, Pete Savy, who was chaplain and pastor of the church, kind of was involved in that, because they were trying to find a place where people could meet, exchange ideas, gather back then. And so it was a place where you got a lot of people who talked about issues and concerns and protests, and in addition to their own personal thing. And so it was in the basement of Hogue Hall, no, on the first floor, right outside the chaplain's office, because WJRH was in the basement.
Was in the basement, right?
And it's just, you know, you could do a whole story about that, you know, during the time that the 1970 strike, because I was on the radio station staff, and I think we kept the station on 24/7 with information about what people were doing, where people were going, had people in and talked about that, played music, but that's a whole other story. But that's what the gourd was. It was really a gathering place for people, generally in terms of people who are involved in protest movements and concern about the war, racial issues, and all of that, which kind of reflected something of what Pete was doing and thinking about. He was open to a whole kind of thing. If you listen to, I think it was Jerry Gill, gave a lecture one time and mentioned, you know, who was involved in terms of supporting African American efforts during that time. So it'll be a good thing to look in the archives.
Cool. I definitely will. You know, one of the things that fascinates me is, you know, if you look at the student organizations and the kind of trajectory at Lafayette, it follows that of lots of other schools where the students used to organize all of this stuff themselves. I mean, maybe the chaplain or something was providing the space, but now this is all very much administered, you know, by this wonderful staff of student life administrators who are, you know, kind of running these organizations. Not, you know, the students themselves still organize the clubs and everything, but that there's a whole layer of administration of that the students sort of expect to be there, that takes care of a lot of the you know, budgetary issues and stuff. And so you really sort of lose that, at least that organizing capacity. Maybe you could argue the students are freer to, you know, just do what they want to do than you know, spend so much time organizing. But you do lose something when, you know, when you've got that in this staff organizing everything for you versus actually having to go out and talk to homeless people about what they need. And, you know, there's a need here, we better do something about it, you know? So I really appreciate that perspective.
Yeah.
I'm saying, I've seen Chris, it looks like we're up against 2:01. I know people have had to leave for work and everything, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody. Please feel free to be in touch with me if I've said anything idiotic, or if you wanted to follow up with me about anything. I would I would love to hear your perspectives, and just continue the conversation, ironically on social media or email. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All
Appreciate it.
right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care.